$80 away from losing the only house he had ever owned, a grieving widower spent his last $250 on a condemned, bat-infested sanatorium that the whole county wanted demolished. He just wanted the copper pipes. But when he pried apart a bricked-up doorway on his first morning inside, what spilled out of that hidden corridor didn't just rewrite his future. It threatened to end his life before sunrise. Calvin Broussard was 61 years old and had spent 34 of those years as a licensed electrician in Kenora, Ontario. He was not the kind of man who made reckless decisions. He kept a spreadsheet for grocery runs. He changed his truck's oil 400 kilometers before the manufacturer's recommendation. He had never once, in 3.5 decades of marriage, forgotten his wife Sandra's birthday. But Sandra had been gone for 7 months now, pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, and the careful, measured life Calvin had built around her had quietly disintegrated in her absence. The medical bills had come first, then the missed mortgage payments while he sat in the hospital corridor for 3 weeks straight, unable to think about anything except the sound of her breathing. Then the letter from the bank, formal and bloodless, informing him that his home on Lakeview Drive faced foreclosure proceedings if the arrears were not resolved within 60 days. Calvin had read the letter 3 times sitting at the kitchen table. Sandra had picked out at a garage sale in 2003, the one with the wobbly left leg she had always meant to fix, and he had not cried. He had simply folded the letter very precisely along its original creases and placed it in the junk drawer next to its dead flashlight battery and a coupon for a grocery store that had closed in 2019. He had missed the bank's 60-day window by $80, not $800, not $8,000, $80, and a bank clerk on the phone who was sympathetic and utterly unable to do anything about it. The file was moving to final sale unless a lump sum landed in his account before the next review date. And it would need to be a great deal more than $80 now, since the bank's patience, once spent, did not come back cheap. Calvin had $250 left to his name. It was not enough to matter to the mortgage. It was, he decided, enough to gamble. It was a Thursday in early October when Calvin found himself in the basement meeting room of the Kenora Municipal Hall, wedged into a plastic chair between a property developer in a pressed blazer and a woman furiously annotating a real estate printout. Calvin was not supposed to be there. He had driven down to submit a formal extension request to the county tax office. His old union rep had told him there was a procedure, a form, a window of appeal. But the tax office was closed for a staff training day, and the notice on the door had redirected anyone with county business to the auction room downstairs, where Wren County's annual tax deed sale was already underway. The room smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent lighting. A tall, angular woman named Gwen Farless ran the proceedings from behind a folding table with the flat efficiency of someone who had done this every October for 20 years and had long since stopped finding it interesting. She moved through parcels quickly, abandoned farmland, a stripped commercial unit on Main Street, a derelict bait shop out near Rushing River, and the developers in the room absorbed each property with minimum fuss, making low bids in clipped, practiced voices. Calvin was about to leave when Farless turned over her page and read the next entry. Lot 31C, Lakeview Sanatorium property, County Road 7, approximately 4.2 acres including the existing structure, former psychiatric facility, operated 1951 to 1987, decommissioned by provincial order. Administrative liens plus outstanding municipal taxes bring the minimum opening bid to $250. She paused and looked up at the room over the rim of her glasses. I'll note for anyone unfamiliar, the structure contains confirmed hazardous materials. Environmental assessment from 2019 is available on file. Bidders assume full liability. The developer in the blazer actually laughed, very quietly, through his nose. Nobody raised their hand. Calvin knew the building. Everyone in Kenora knew the building. Lakeview Sanatorium sat 3 kilometers outside of town on a ridge above the lake, a long stone and brick Victorian hulk that had once housed over 200 patients. It had been closed abruptly in 1987 when the province restructured its psychiatric services, and the operator's license was revoked following a government review whose full findings had, for reasons no one had ever satisfactorily explained, been sealed. Local teenagers dared each other to walk its perimeter at night. The county had tried to demolish it twice, but the asbestos survey alone had cost the municipality $40,000, and the actual abatement estimate came back at over $2 million. The building existed in a permanent administrative limbo, too dangerous to develop, too expensive to destroy, too historically listed to quietly ignore. Buying it was not a rational act. Calvin understood this. He also understood with sudden and quiet clarity that the 2 copper water mains running the full length of that building were 1950s-era solid copper pipe, that the scrapyard on Highway 17 was paying $4.15 a kilogram, and that a building that size could hold enough copper to buy him real breathing room with the bank. Far more than $80. He had a truck, a set of wrenches, and absolutely nothing left to lose. He raised his hand. Farless looked at him with the same expression someone might give a person who had ordered fish at a steakhouse. "I have a bid of $250 from the gentleman in the back. Are you aware of the environmental liabilities attached to this parcel, sir?" "I am," Calvin said. His voice was steadier than he felt. Going once. The developer had already turned back to his phone, going twice. Another pause. Sold for $250. The man in the blazer turned around in his chair. His name was Warren Tilsley. Calvin would later learn this, and he had been quietly acquiring distressed properties in Wren County for the better part of a decade. He looked at Calvin the way adults look at children who have announced implausible career ambitions. "You know the asbestos abatement on that building is going to run you close to $3 million, right?" Calvin did not respond. He walked to the front table, wrote a check for the full $250. Every dollar in the account down to the change. Signed 5 pages of documents he would read more carefully later, and walked back out into the cold October air. He sat in the cab of his truck for a long time. The sky above Kenora was the specific gray of a sky that cannot decide whether to rain or simply threaten to. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and tried to calculate whether he had just made the worst decision of his life. He concluded, with some certainty, that he probably had. But then he thought about the pipes. He turned the key and drove toward County Road 7. The Lakeview Sanatorium was larger than he remembered from the road. Up close, past the collapsed chain-link fence the county had stopped maintaining in 2015, it was enormous, 4 stories of pale limestone brick running 200 meters along the ridge, its rows of tall, narrow windows either boarded over or simply gaping open to the weather. The stone entrance portico had lost 2 of its 4 columns, leaving the roof sagging at a precarious angle over what had once been the main admissions door. Wild sumac had colonized the east wing entirely. A crow sat on the roofline and observed Calvin's arrival with complete indifference. He popped the tailgate, loaded his pack with wrenches, a pry bar, a heavy work flashlight, and 2 bottles of water, and pulled a P100 respirator down around his neck in case the dust got thick. He had worked in enough decommissioned buildings over the years to know how to move carefully. He found a side maintenance entrance at the north end of the building. The padlock was so corroded that one firm tap with the pry bar separated it from the hasp, and stepped inside. The smell hit him first: mildew, old plaster, the specific damp mineral scent of a stone building that had been sealed against the weather for decades with imperfect success. Then the silence, which was not actually silence, but a layered absence of normal sound. No traffic, no voices, only the intermittent groan of stressed timber, and somewhere high in the building, the faint percussion of a loose shutter moving in the wind. Calvin clicked on his flashlight and began to work. The main copper runs were in the basement, as he had expected, flanking the old boiler room. He spent the first 2 hours down there, methodically unbolting pipe sections and stacking them near the maintenance entrance. It was honest work, unglamorous and physical, and the familiar rhythm of it was almost a relief, the kind of labor that required just enough concentration to keep other thoughts at bay. By mid-afternoon, he had amassed what he estimated was 40 or 50 kilograms of pipe, perhaps $200 worth at current scrap rates. A start. Not enough yet, but a start. He was cutting a stubborn junction fitting on the second floor when the temperature dropped without warning. October in northern Ontario does not give notice. Within 20 minutes, a hard wind had come off the lake, and the loose shutter that had been tapping irregularly all afternoon became a sustained hammering. Rain followed, not a gradual rain, but a sudden October downpour that turned the gravel outside to running water and made the boarded windows rattle in their frames. Calvin looked at his phone. The road back to the highway was unpaved gravel, and his truck rode on 2-year-old all-seasons that he had been meaning to replace since spring. Driving it in a sideways rainstorm on wet gravel in the dark was not a sensible option. He had lived in the north long enough to know that improvised decisions in bad weather were how people ended up in the ditch at 11 p.m. with no cell signal and a dead battery. He would wait it out. He explored the upper floors, looking for a room intact enough to be comfortable. The patient wards were gutted and water-damaged, their iron bed frames rusted into abstract shapes, their floors buckled by decades of freeze-thaw cycles. But on the third floor, at the end of a long hallway with wallpaper peeling in long, slow curls like birch bark, he found the medical director's office. The room was oddly preserved. A heavy oak desk dominated the center. 2 wooden filing cabinets stood against the wall, locked. Framed certificates and photographs covered the paneled walls, staff portraits, provincial inspection certificates, a group photograph dated 1962 showing men in white coats standing in front of the building's entrance. The windows were intact. The room smelled of old paper and undisturbed dust, but it was dry and it was out of the wind. Calvin pulled the high-backed desk chair into the corner, farthest from the window, unzipped his jacket to use as a makeshift pillow, and sat down to wait. He told himself he would not sleep. He was asleep within 12 minutes. He woke to a sound he could not immediately place. A low, rhythmic clicking from somewhere inside the wall. Then a mechanical grind, like a gear disengaging, followed by a dull thump that he felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled through the floor and up the legs of the chair. Calvin sat very still. The room was dark except for the grey seepage of cloud-filtered moonlight around the window frame. The wind outside had died. Whatever had woken him was inside. He reached for his flashlight and held it without turning it on. The sound had stopped. The room was perfectly quiet. He waited 1 minute, 2. Then he turned on the light. The beam swept the room slowly. Filing cabinets, desks, certificates. The group photograph from 1962. Another larger photograph opposite it. The medical director, a square-jawed man Calvin did not recognize, shaking hands with someone in a suit. A provincial crest visible in the background. Calvin stood up and looked more carefully at the photographs. The director's nameplate in the 1962 group shot read Dr. Emmett Holt, medical director, 1958 to 1987. Calvin had never heard the name. He was about to sit back down when his flashlight caught something on the floor. The dust in the director's office was thick and uniform everywhere, except for one spot directly in front of the large filing cabinet against the east wall. There, the dust was scuffed, disturbed, recently, by something heavier than a rat. Calvin crouched and looked more carefully. The scratches in the floor were deep, parallel, and ran from beneath the filing cabinet straight to the baseboard. They looked like drag marks, as though the cabinet had been pulled away from the wall and then pushed back. He stood up and gripped the side of the filing cabinet. It was heavy, far heavier than an empty cabinet should be. He pulled. It moved smoothly, far more smoothly than decades of inertia should have allowed, as though the base had been fitted with hidden casters. The cabinet swung outward on a concealed hinge, revealing the wall behind it. The wall was not wallpapered like the rest of the room. It was raw plaster, and set into the plaster was a metal plate, roughly square, about the size of a fuse box cover, with a single small slot in the center. Not a keyhole. A narrow horizontal slot, like a mail slot, but smaller, the size of a token. Calvin stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the desk. On the desk, half buried under a collapsed stack of papers, was a small metal dish, the kind that had once sat on every professional's desk to hold paper clips or spare change. It was empty, but in the corner of the dish, held against the rim by the angle of the container, was a single heavy coin. Not a quarter. Calvin picked it up and rubbed the grime off with the rough seam of his jacket. It was a thick, custom-milled brass medallion, roughly the diameter of a loonie but twice the weight. One side showed the silhouette of the sanatorium building and the year 1951. The other side was blank except for a single word, Lakeview. Calvin looked at the slot in the wall. He looked at the coin. He pressed the medallion into the slot. It slid in cleanly. There was a half-second pause, long enough for him to feel slightly foolish, and then, from somewhere deep in the wall, a sequence of mechanical sounds. A click, a gear engaging, a second click. The filing cabinet shuddered on its hidden hinge. And then, slowly, the entire section of plaster wall began to move, rotating inward on a vertical axis, like a revolving door, revealing a passage barely wide enough for a grown man to enter sideways. Cold air poured out of the passage, carrying a smell Calvin recognized from very old basements. Dry stone, stale air, and something faintly chemical, like old photographic developer. He stood at the entrance and shone his light into the passage. It ran about 4 meters before turning sharply to the right. The walls were poured concrete. The floor was swept. Not merely clean, but deliberately, recently swept. The concrete dry and free of the accumulated grime that covered every other surface in the building. Someone had been here not 30 years ago, recently. Calvin's grip tightened on his pry bar. He went in anyway. The passage turned right and then opened immediately into a room. Not a large room, perhaps 4 meters by 5, but the walls were solid poured concrete, 3 courses thick by the look of the exposed corner, and the ceiling was low enough that Calvin had to duck his head at the entrance. The far wall held a row of heavy steel shelving units, the kind used in industrial warehouses. They were loaded with sealed boxes, their lids taped shut with thick packing tape that had yellowed but held. On the shelf at eye level, arranged with a precision that stood out against the building's general decay, were 3 things. A Remington typewriter with a sheet of paper still loaded in the platen, a brown accordion file folder tied with a cotton cord, and a large leather-bound ledger. Calvin opened the ledger first. The handwriting inside was small, precise, and meticulous. It was not patient records. It was a financial log, dates, names, amounts. The entries ran from 1961 to 1986. The names beside the amounts were not patients' names. They were names Calvin could not immediately identify. But several of the entries had annotations beside them in a different hand, smaller and more cramped, that included provincial ministry references and what looked like case file numbers. He opened the accordion folder next. Inside were photographs, clinical photographs, the kind taken for medical documentation, black and white, shot under harsh institutional lighting. They showed the interiors of rooms he recognized as patient wards. But the photographs were not medical records. The annotations on the back, typed on small adhesive labels, were different. Patient names, dates, and beside each name, a dollar figure. Calvin sat back on his heels. He was beginning to understand, in a slow and nauseating way, what he was looking at. He was reaching for the typewritten sheet still loaded in the Remington when the sound reached him. A footstep. From the passage behind him, deliberate, unhurried, and very close. Calvin killed his flashlight. In the absolute blackness of the concrete room, he pressed himself against the shelving unit and did not breathe. A beam of light appeared at the passage entrance. Then a figure stepped through the low doorway, straightening to full height as he entered the room. He was tall, perhaps 65, with the kind of broad-shouldered build that speaks of physical confidence rather than bulk, wearing a waxed canvas hunting jacket and carrying a powerful LED lantern. His face, when the lantern light caught it, was expressionless, not calm but simply blank in the way faces go blank when the person behind them has already settled on an outcome. Calvin knew the face. He had seen it in the auction room that morning, turned around in the front row. Warren Tilsley. "You move quietly for a tradesman," Tilsley said, his voice entirely conversational. He did not appear startled by Calvin's presence. He set the lantern on the bottom shelf and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He removed a compact black pistol and held it at his side, not yet raised the way a man holds a tool he expects to use shortly. Calvin's mouth was dry. "You followed me here." "I've been following this property for 4 years, Tilsley said. He glanced at the open ledger on the floor with something close to satisfaction. "You saved me a significant amount of time. I've been through every office in this building twice, and I could not find the activation mechanism." He looked at the coin slot in the wall without turning his head. Clever of the old man to hide it as a keepsake in plain sight. "Halt," Calvin said. "My grandfather." Tilsley moved the lantern slightly to illuminate the shelf of sealed boxes. Emmett Holt built this facility. He also built a very efficient parallel revenue stream alongside the legitimate psychiatric services. Provincial money allocated per patient, federal research grants, private payments from families who wanted certain relatives managed discreetly, long-term. The documentation in those boxes represents 30 years of financial arrangements that a number of people in provincial government would still find very inconvenient. My grandfather understood the value of leverage. He kept everything. The license revocation, Calvin said. He was watching the gun, calculating angles, finding nothing useful. A junior ministry auditor noticed a discrepancy in the per-patient billing in 1986. My grandfather sealed this room, retired with his documentation intact, and died in 1994, believing the province would eventually pay to have the building demolished, and the whole question would resolve itself. Tilsley's expression shifted very slightly, something between contempt and grudging respect. He underestimated how badly the county would manage the asbestos problem. "I intended to buy the property today, clear this room out quietly, and arrange for the rest to burn within the month. You complicated that by outbidding me. You let me win the bid. I underestimated you. I assumed a man buying a condemned building for scrap would take what he could carry and leave before dark." A brief pause. "I won't make the same mistake again." Calvin looked at the man's eyes. He had worked in enough buildings and met enough people over 34 years to know when someone had already made a decision they weren't going to revisit. Tilsley had settled on this outcome before he'd even come through the passage. He was simply narrating it aloud with the thoroughness of a man who'd been waiting a long time to say it. Calvin's right hand was resting on the shelf behind him. His fingers found the edge of the ledger. He thought about Sandra, not her illness, not the end, but a specific Saturday morning. The two of them at the kitchen table, coffee going cold, while they argued cheerfully about something neither of them could remember by noon. The wobbly-legged table. The coupon for the closed grocery store. He thought she would not have sat here quietly. He gripped the ledger and threw it hard and fast at the LED lantern. The ledger was large and heavy, and it connected with the lantern at the base. The lantern toppled off the shelf, hit the concrete floor, and went out. Total darkness. Tilsley fired. The shot was deafeningly loud in the concrete room, and Calvin felt the air move close to his ear. And then Calvin was moving. Not toward the passage. Toward the shelving unit. He gripped the upright support with both hands and pulled with everything he had. The shelving unit was loaded with sealed boxes, each one heavy, and the combined weight was substantial. It toppled with a slow, terrible inevitability, boxes cascading, steel frame twisting. Tilsley shouted something that got cut off by the impact. Calvin did not wait to assess the result. He dropped to his hands and knees, swept his hand across the floor until he found his pry bar where he'd dropped it, then navigated the passage by memory. 4 meters, sharp left, 1 step up to the pivot door. He burst through the filing cabinet entrance into the director's office, spinning around to face the passage. He could hear Tilsley moving in the concrete room, swearing in a low, sustained voice that suggested injury, but not incapacitation. Calvin grabbed the edge of the filing cabinet and hauled it back toward the wall. The hinge mechanism resisted. It was designed to swing outward, not to be forced back. And for a terrible few seconds, Calvin stood there pulling with shaking arms against the cabinet's weight, while the sounds from the passage grew louder. Then the hinge gave. The cabinet swung back flush against the wall. Calvin heard the plaster panel on the other side click into its resting position. He grabbed the heavy oak desk chair and jammed it sideways under the door handle of the director's office. He picked up his pack, his flashlight, and his pry bar, and ran. The OPP cruiser arrived at the County Road 7 turnoff at 11:43 p.m., 40 minutes after Calvin had run a kilometer down the gravel road in the rain and flagged down a logging truck on the highway. The driver, a laconic man from Dryden who had seen stranger things, lent Calvin his phone without comment. By 2 a.m., the Lakeview Sanatorium property was lit by the portable lights of 2 OPP units, an RCMP serious crimes vehicle out of Thunder Bay, and an ambulance. Warren Tilsley was extracted from the hidden passage by 2 OPP officers and a crowbar. He had a fractured left arm from the shelving collapse, and a disposition that his lawyer, reached by phone within the hour, immediately instructed him to stop expressing. Calvin sat on the tailgate of an OPP truck wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, drinking coffee from a thermos someone had handed him without explanation. His hands had stopped shaking by the time a woman in plainclothes and a blue RCMP windbreaker walked over and introduced herself as Sergeant Lena Park, out of the Thunder Bay Serious Crimes Unit. "Mr. Broussard," she said, sitting on the tailgate beside him without ceremony. "The materials in that room, the ledgers, the documents in those sealed boxes, are going to take us a significant amount of time to assess fully, but I want you to understand what you appear to have found." "A 30-year-old cover-up," Calvin said. "At minimum." Lena looked out at the building. "The per-patient billing fraud alone is a significant provincial matter. But the photographs and the documents in the accordion file point to something we've had unconfirmed allegations about for a long time. Undisclosed pharmaceutical trials conducted on patients without documented consent, with payments coming into the facility from at least 2 pharmaceutical intermediaries. So Emmett Holt wasn't just running a billing scheme. He was running a commercial research operation inside a licensed psychiatric facility." She paused. "The names in those ledgers include at least 2 people who still hold provincial appointments." Calvin absorbed this. The coffee was too hot, but he drank it anyway. "What about Warren Tilsley?" "Criminal mischief, possession of a restricted firearm, discharging a firearm in a dangerous manner, and obstruction, given that he was there to acquire and destroy evidence tied to what may turn out to be historical criminal activity." She looked at him carefully. "You'll need legal representation. This is going to be a long process." "I don't have a lawyer. I don't really have anything." It came out quieter and more blunt than he intended. "I bought this building because I was $80 short of saving my house. I'm telling you that so you understand the full picture." Sergeant Park was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you aware that Wren County holds a standing heritage preservation fund administered through the provincial ministry? Properties of historical and evidentiary significance can be subject to emergency municipal acquisition at assessed value." She looked at the building again. Assessed value on a 4.2-acre parcel with a substantial stone structure in northern Ontario, even in its current condition, tends to run well above whatever it sold for at a tax auction. "I'm not making any promises," she added. "I'm telling you the county has procedures, and that what you found tonight is going to matter to a lot of people." The formal assessment took 11 weeks. The sealed boxes in the hidden concrete room contained, in total, documentation covering 31 years of fraudulent per-patient billing, records of undisclosed pharmaceutical trials affecting an estimated 140 patients, and financial correspondence implicating 7 individuals in provincial ministry positions. 4 deceased, 2 retired, and 1 currently serving as chair of a standing provincial health committee. Warren Tilsley was charged on 6 counts and released on conditions that included surrendering his passport. His legal team was excellent and expensive, and the proceedings would, as Sergeant Park had predicted, take a long time. The Wren County Heritage and Property Trust acquired the Lakeview Sanatorium property from Calvin Broussard under the Provincial Emergency Preservation Clause at an assessed fair market value of $340,000, less the original lien amount. The net transfer to Calvin, after county administrative fees, was $339,750. In addition, an advocacy organization working on behalf of former patients and their families, quietly funded through a provincial settlement whose terms Calvin was not party to, issued him a formal recognition payment for the recovery of the documentation. The paperwork described it as a community contribution acknowledgement. The amount was $175,000. Calvin hired a lawyer. He paid off the bank arrears on the house on Lakeview Drive in a single transfer. The $80 that had once felt like the entire world cleared along with everything else in under a minute. He replaced the truck's tires. He fixed the wobbly leg on Sandra's kitchen table. It took 11 minutes and a single furniture bolt, and he couldn't understand why either of them had lived with it for 22 years. On a Thursday afternoon in early March, he stood on the front step of the house and looked out at the lake, which was just beginning to show dark patches where the ice was pulling back from the shore. The foreclosure notice had come down the week before. The step needed repainting. The eave screws on the north side had a sag he'd been meaning to address since September. He had a list. He had time. He went inside to start the coffee and let the cat in from the cold. If you'd walked into that auction room and seen a tired man in a worn jacket raise his hand for a condemned building that nobody else wanted, you might have done what everyone else did, looked away, moved on, assumed the story ended in the parking lot with a bad decision and a long drive home, but sometimes the worst bid in the room turns out to be the only honest one. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in that concrete room? And if you want more stories about ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary places, hit subscribe and stay close. There's always another door worth opening.